Hello, everybody. Welcome to this guest lecture for Monica Attard's Advanced Journalism course. My name is Michael Davis. I work with Monica at the Centre for Media Transition, where I lead the Information Disorder program here, which is a research program where we look at phenomena like online misinformation, disinformation, fake news, manipulated media, and related phenomena. We also look at attempts to regulate digital platforms to address phenomena like misinformation and other information disorders, potential solutions to this relatively novel problem and other related issues. Right, let's get started. I'll just share my screen. Great. So today we're going to be looking at, a bit of background on these phenomena, why they've become so prominent lately, the causes and effects, attempts to mitigate harms arising from the problems, regulation, and so on, and especially the implications for journalism. Right, let's start with an image that some of you might be familiar with over the last few weeks or so, just very recent. A series of fake images that started to spread online when news broke that Donald Trump was about to be arrested or indicted for the Stormy Daniels case. And the series of images that were generated through the latest generation of AI tools, which use text prompts to generate images by cobbling together data essentially from around the internet, which is used to train these AI tools. And these images, spread very rapidly and were shared, many of them, in many cases, as if they were genuine images. And this raises the question, what do we call these sorts of images? Are they fake news? Are they misinformation? Is it a hoax? Is it a satire, form of satire? Is it just someone on the internet doing things for laughs? Well, as it turns out, these images were actually generated by a journalist who works for Bellingcat, an investigative journalism collective. And he used these AI tools to conjure up a series of images of Trump's arrest. So he made iterations, if you like, of his prompts into the AI tool. And he said he generated these images and posted them as a form of experiment, really, just to see how well these AI tools did at generating these images. The problem being, though, of course, is that once the images go online, they can easily be shared by others, and when they're shared, they often lose the context in which they're originally created, or the purpose for which the original creator actually put them online. And so Higgins, the Bellingcat journalist, stated that in his Twitter thread when he posted them, that these images were AI generated, but as they went on to be shared, an Instagram post, for example, sharing some of Higgins' images as if they were genuine, then garnered more than 79,000 likes on Instagram. And so the question is, well, this is perhaps not the wisest strategy for Higgins to pursue. As an investigative journalist, you might argue that he should know better about the kinds of things that can happen when these sorts of images are propagated on the internet, and particularly taken out of context in the way that they were. And that's part of the problem here, is because these images are not just any images, right? They're political images, and they're being spread in an environment of political polarization, immense distrust on both sides of politics in America, incredible interest in what's going on around the world, and almost guaranteed, of course, to take off and be and to go viral. All right. And with that as a kind of introduction, let's move into uh, further into the presentation. Right. I want to start off, after that thought that we've been thinking of there about, okay, what are the kinds of phenomena that we group under these concepts of fake news, as it first came to be known as when in the lead up to the 2016 election. What is now often called misinformation or disinformation. We prefer to use the term information disorder, which comes from two scholars, Claire Wardle and Hossein Darakhshan, who worked with the Council of Europe to develop a framework for understanding these phenomena and moving towards the ability to address them and regulate for them in the EU context. But there's a whole plethora of terms that are used, in this area. Some of these include, as we've seen, fake news, false news, misinformation and disinformation, old terms like propaganda, influence operations, information warfare. And there's also a whole range of overlapping phenomena that, are related to these, what you might call epistemic phenomena that are to do with information and knowledge and truth. And these are things like internet hoaxes and satire, but also in phenomena like hate speech, online abuse, and on the other political side, political polarization, conspiracy theories, and so on. Now, if we look at this simple framework of information disorder here that Wardle and Darakhshan have put together, you can see that we've got two axes differentiating these concepts. One is whether the content is true or false, and the other is whether the content was spread online or created in order to cause harm of some sort. And with those two axes, then we get a three-way split between these three phenomena: misinformation, which is false information without an intention to harm; disinformation, which is false information where there is an intention to harm; and malinformation, which is true or accurate information where there is still it's spread with the intention to cause someone harm. Now, this way of dividing up these concepts here has become very influential in policy developments and regulation developments, looking to address these phenomena and to mitigate the harms arising from them. And that's kind of flowed on as well into the media. Now you often hear about, particularly, you don't hear much about malinformation so much, and we're not going to spend too much time on that. But you do hear about a distinction between misinformation and disinformation, with the relevant difference being that disinformation is spread in order to cause harm, and misinformation is kind of innocently spread, if you like, where for example, there might be a genuine belief in the information, such as anti-vaccine content and so on, conspiracy theories and so on. Look, we're going to come back to this framework a little bit later on and see how it's manifested in terms of regulation and the first movements to legislate to regulate this area. But I just what I want you to think about here is whether this categorization is adequate in terms of capturing all these different phenomena. So what we're going to do now is look through a series of examples of information disorder, if you like, of different kinds. And we're going to look at these twin axes of whether it's true or false, and whether there's an intention to harm or not. And the object here is really to kind of to raise questions about whether this certainly simple and clear framework is actually helpful or not. Right. So the first example we're looking at here is something from the lead up to the 2016 presidential election in the US, where uh, a man called Paul Horner, a young man, was making money essentially from his website or a series of websites where he posted clickbait articles, essentially satire or hoax articles, in the same way that The Onion, for example, which is another famous satirical website. Let me just. Sorry, I'll just fix the lighting here. Okay, apologies for that. I just had to turn the lights back on. So what we have here is Paul Horner, as I said, running a website, essentially a satirical website, where he started to share stories about Donald Trump in the lead up to the US election. And these stories for him were pretty crazy, pretty unhinged, and made up essentially in the same way that, as I said, The Onion or here the Batuta Advocate, for example, makes up stories that essentially jokes. But what happened was that his stories started to get picked up by Trump supporters and spread on social media. So one of his stories here is an example that the Amish in America commit their vote to Donald Trump, mathematically guaranteeing him a presidential victory, and shared on what is ostensibly ABC News, which, as you probably know, is an American news channel as well as an Australian one. The only difference here was that ABC News was not the actual web address was abcnews.com.co, so not the genuine article. And here, Horner tells us that he thought that the stories would be fact checked and it would make them look worse. So the point here is that when the story gets picked up, his intention was when the story got picked up and put on Trump supporters' social media, picked up by Fox News and media channels like that, that as soon as it went out, that the story would be fact checked, and that would essentially embarrass the Trump supporting media channels. That's what he says. I mean, that's how this always works. Someone posts something I write, they find out it's false, and then they look like idiots. He says his sites were picked up by Trump supporters all the time. And he confessed, I think Trump is in the White House because of me. His followers don't fact check anything. They'll post everything, believe anything. Of course, maybe delusions of grandeur there, but some of these stories were picked up quite a lot. And you can see down the bottom of the screen there in a Google result. The Amish vote for Donald Trump is the prompt into Google, and this story is the first one that comes up going to this website here, which is essentially, if you like, a fake news website, right? It's got information purporting to be news stories, but they're fake. In the same way that, as I said, The Onion or Batuta Advocate are fake news stories. Now, of course, when we talk about fake news, that's not generally what we mean, but there's a relation here. So here we can think about, well, okay, is this misinformation? Well, it's false, true. What's the intention behind it? Is there an intention to deceive or to cause harm? Well, okay, there's an intention maybe to deceive, but not really. I mean, the real intention here was to have a laugh, essentially, a bit of satire of the political process in America and a certain side of politics. But once the information moves from there and is circulated around social media, you might say, well, okay, in that case, it does become misinformation, right? If it's shared for nefarious means, to undermine a political process, maybe it becomes disinformation. Okay, the point is that the boundaries between these categories are not as clear as they might have appeared when we looked at that conceptual schema in the last slide. Right. The next slide we're looking at here is again related to the 2016 US elections, where another kind of fake news site came to prominence just days before the election, 4 days before the election, in fact. So BuzzFeed revealed at that time that more than 140 Macedonian websites were publishing pro-Trump stories. And the content was mostly recycled from hyper-partisan US sites and republished on Facebook to earn advertising click-throughs. So this is essentially the same purpose that that Horner had. Horner was making money from people going to his website and clicking through on the advertising, and that provided him with an income. In Macedonia, the same thing was happening. That these people had really no interest, no political interest in the US election. At least it seemed that way at first, and rather, students in Macedonia, in a small town called Veles, where the economy was struggling, people found that they could earn money by sharing fake news about the US election, and they could earn more money than they could doing other things. And I guess the monetization here, why did they choose to participate in the US election, was just because they could earn more money by doing that, because US users were more likely to click through on the advertising, more likely to spend money on products that they find online, and so on. So they actually made more money by engaging in US politics. The effect of it, of course, though, was that of increasing polarization in America, in the political debate, spreading misinformation because these stories were not vetted or fact-checked. They were taken from, as I said, hyper-partisan US sites and recycled as if they were genuine news content and then shared on Facebook, for example. Here we get a perspective on what was happening from Tamara, who was one of the workers in these Macedonian fake news farms. So the information was true in the sense that they were talking about things that actually happened, right? They weren't fake stories in the sense of fabricating every detail, but it was propaganda and brainwashing in the way the story was told. The way the story is promoted and the way that the stories were taken up by in social media amongst US users, and propagated and promoted again by hyperpartisan sites and recycled in this way, was in effect very polarizing and damaging and polluting to the political debate in the lead up to the US election. And you can see here on the graph on the left the total Facebook engagements for the top 20 election stories. You can see that mainstream news started out with high engagement and dropped during the course of 2016. And fake news stories started out with lower engagement, and by the time of the election had actually overtaken engagement, had surpassed mainstream engagement for mainstream news on Facebook. Of course, people still watch news on television and so on, but what we're looking at here is engagement with online news stories. Okay, of course, what happened was after the election, it became clear that there had been some interference, foreign interference in the US election process, and in the digital public sphere, if you like, where Russian agents and Russian bots had been used to manipulate the online conversations in the lead up to the election. And this was the subject of an inquiry by the US House Intelligence Committee. And in May 2018, the committee released more than 3,000 advertisements that the Russian Internet Research Agency had run on Facebook and Instagram between 2015 and 2017. And more than 11.4 million American users have been exposed to these ads. And here we have an example of one of those ads from a group called Stop AI. A strange association, but here you can see that it's a very polarizing advertisement, engaging with racist sentiments, I guess, in certain sectors, in certain demographics in America, but engaging with the political debate at the same time. We can imagine, of course, perhaps a similar advertisement running in some cases in Australia. So what was interesting about this is that the advertisements were developed by the Internet Research Agency, which is an arm of the Russian government, and directed at particular demographics in America. And different advertisements were used and directed at different demographics. And the real purpose of it was to drive engagement and to drive polarization, and essentially to drive, to up the ante in the online political debate, and cause ructions in the long term as well as the short term in American democracy and American political processes. So to that extent, these advertisements are sometimes true, sometimes false. The point is not really, for the disinformation agents, the Internet Research Agency, the Russians, the point is not to spread false information necessarily, but to polarize and to stir up strong emotions amongst ordinary citizens and disrupt the political process in that way. You can see here that the amount of engagement that this advertisement got, 235,000 shares, so quite significant. Sorry, go back so you can see that. So 16,000 reactions, 1,700 comments, and 235,000 shares. And just carrying on further with this phenomenon, the same series of events where the Internet Research Agency, the Russian disinformation agents, for political purposes, are conducting information warfare. Now, the term disinformation actually comes from a Russian word. I won't attempt to pronounce it, but it's essentially related to information warfare, or essentially synonymous with information warfare. This idea of undermining trust in the public sphere, in media discourse, in political processes, and so on. That's the purpose of it. So that's a little bit narrow, if you like, or quite distinct from what we saw the definition of disinformation being earlier on from the Wardle and Direction schema, which was that disinformation is false information shared with an intention to harm. Now, clearly here, in this kind of disinformation in the old sense, traditional sense, or information warfare, there is an intention to cause harm, to disrupt democratic processes and undermine public trust. But it doesn't really rely on false information necessarily. Rather, the aim is to cause confusion. And so here's an example of the way that different advertisements were targeted at different demographics. So in our first case, we have from an account called Being Patriotic, we have a story about another gruesome attack on police by a Black Lives Matter movement activist. Our hearts are with those 11 heroes. You can see how this kind of story would take off amongst particular demographic or particular political groups in America. As it turns out, the story itself is true, in the sense that there was an attack by someone called Kirk Figueroa on 2 Boston police officers, and he was in fact killed then by the other officers. But Kirk Figueroa was not connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, and it was something that had occurred several years before the Black Lives Matter movement had actually started to take off in the US. So here you might say that the story itself about Kirk Figueroa was true, but it's being used in a false context and being linked to current events in a way that is misleading or deceptive even. On the other side, we have a story about from someone called Blacktivist. And here, this is a story about the Black Panthers, posted to social media. Never forget that the Black Panthers, a group formed to protect Black people from the Ku Klux Klan, was dismantled by the US government, but the Ku Klux Klan exists today. Now, this is actually false. The FBI did seek to dismantle the Black Panthers in the 1960s, but the party actually continued into the 1980s until it dissolved. But, whether it's true or false, I think here the sentiment is what is important, right? And both these stories have been posted by the Internet Research Agency or people connected with the Internet Research Agency, and targeted at different groups. So the one on the left targeted at probably Republican voting, white voters, and the one on the right at Black voters and the Black community. Right, here I'm going to attempt to play this video. Just bear with me for a moment. Share sound. Right, great.
A grand jury in the District of Columbia today returned an indictment presented by the Special Counsel's Office. The indictment charges 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian companies for committing federal crimes while seeking to interfere in the United States political system, including the 2016 presidential election. The defendants allegedly conducted what they called information warfare against the United States, with the stated goal of spreading distrust towards the candidates and the political system in general. According to the allegations in the indictment, 12 of the individual defendants worked at various times for a company called Internet Research Agency, LLC, a Russian company based in St. Petersburg. The other individual defendant, Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin, funded the conspiracy through companies known as Concord Management and Consulting, LLC, Concord Catering, and many affiliates and subsidiaries. The conspiracy was part of a larger operation called Project Lakta. Project Lakta included multiple components, some involving domestic audiences within the Russian Federation, and others targeting foreign audiences in multiple countries. Internet Research Agency allegedly operated through Russian shell companies. It employed hundreds of people in its online operations, ranging from creators of fictitious personas to technical and administrative support personnel with an annual budget of millions of dollars. Internet Research Agency was a structured organization headed by a management group and arranged into departments, including graphics, search engine optimization, information technology, and finance departments. In 2014, the company established a translator project focused on the United States. In July of 2016, more than 80 employees were assigned to the translator project. 2 of the defendants allegedly traveled to the United States in 2014 to collect intelligence for their American influence operations. In order to hide the Russian origins of their activities, the defendants allegedly purchased space on computer servers located here in the United States in order to set up a virtual private network. The defendants allegedly used that infrastructure to establish hundreds of accounts on social media networks such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, making it appear that those accounts were controlled by persons located in the United States.
Great. Okay. Right, back to our presentation. So you can see here in Rosenstein's announcement, I guess the kind of infrastructure behind what the Internet Research Agency was doing, and the extent to which that they were engaged in disrupting American political discourse, not only online but in the so-called real world as well, in the sense that they were setting up demonstrations and protests and pitting different groups against one another, quite successfully. Right, moving on from that kind of foreign interference into a related point, which is here about what is called by digital platforms, especially coordinated inauthentic behavior. This is the use of tools like bots, sock puppet accounts, fake accounts, in order to propagate misinformation, disinformation, again, to disrupt online discourse and more broadly political processes. You can see I've got 2 examples here. The first one with bots manipulating public opinion in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Again, the main use of these bots being on the Russian side, I think, but I think the Ukrainian side also has been involved in the use of some of these tools to undermine Russian efforts and to, both to promote particular stories to their own populations and to counteract efforts from the other side to spread propaganda of their own inside the foreign country. Facebook says that coordinated inauthentic behavior is coordinated efforts to manipulate public debate for a strategic goal where fake accounts are central to the operation. Now, coordinated inauthentic behavior is, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later on when we look at what platforms are doing to address these problems. But I'll just say here that it's much easier for platforms to focus on things like user behavior, bot detection, and those kinds of things to address problems than to look at the online content itself. And here we can go back to, again, our schema of information disorder, which focuses, as we saw one axis on truth and falsity, and on the other axis, intention. Now, you could say that the use of bots perhaps is the general intention there is going to be a nefarious one. You're using inauthentic tools, if you like, in order to promote certain content online, or undertake other activities online. But here I just want to raise this another kind of slightly problematic example, I guess, which is the use of bots and fake accounts by K-pop fans to undermine Donald Trump's re-election bid in the last election, the 2020 election. And you might remember this story that these K-pop fans, teenagers, young people essentially, cooked up this scheme to buy tickets to Trump's rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and essentially the outcome being that although lots of tickets were sold or reserved to go to the rally, as it turned out, only a much smaller proportion of people actually turned up, because the K-pop fans and I imagine a whole lot of other people on TikTok, who were interacting with the K-pop fans, cottoned on and picked up some tickets for the Trump rally, and then obviously didn't show. So if we think about this from TikTok's perspective, from the digital platform's perspective, many of these people were encouraged to use fake accounts, fake names, fake phone numbers, and so on to sign up, create accounts, and then purchase these tickets. So to that extent, we'd say, well, okay, what's the purpose here? Is it a deceptive purpose? Is it a purpose to cause harm? Probably not. But in terms and conditions on digital platforms, where fake accounts are prohibited, you can see that that there's a problem here, that we tend to think of this one as a bit of a hoax, a bit of a laugh. It's quite funny. Maybe it coincides with our political views, and we're more forgiving of that strategy than we might be from the use of bots by foreign agents of disinformation, for example. Again, my purpose isn't here to say that one is bad, one is good, they're both bad, nothing like that. All I'm trying to do here is to suggest that this schema of categorizing these online harms in terms of truth and falsity on one hand, and intention to harm on the other, is a bit problematic. And it's problematic in the conceptualization of it, and it's also problematic in the way that platforms take on this conceptualization in their attempts to mitigate the harms arising from these phenomena. The next example is an example from Australian politics, of course, where essentially kind of misleading political advertising was used to spread a rumour that Labor had secret plans to introduce a death tax. And Labor was shocked by the strategy that was being pursued by their political opposition, and quickly moved to rebut the implications that were being spread through online political advertising. As it turned out, these ads were quite effective. These ads were targeted quite well at particular demographics, again, in the same way that we saw with the Internet Research Agency used micro-targeting to target different messages at different groups. The same thing was done here in Australia. And that's another example of what we'll look at in a moment, which is the kind of the features of digital platforms that enable or promote these phenomena, if you like, in the sense that the ability to micro-target messages based on user data and user history and that kind of thing creates a whole new set of possibilities for targeting messages and engaging people in political debate and also propagating misinformation and disinformation. Just a moment, I'm going to fix the lights again. Okay, another aspect of this situation is that because it's political advertising and promoted by political parties or other actors in the political space in Australia, there's actually no restrictions, no legal restrictions, or very, very narrow. There's only very narrow legal restrictions on what can be said, if you like, in political advertising in Australia, and there's no requirement for political advertisements to be true, as long as they're not misleading people in terms of how to vote, in terms of the mechanics of actually voting. And so even though this was false, Labor had no secret plans to introduce a death tax. Essentially, it's left to the marketplace of ideas, if you like, and it's left to Labor and Labor supporters to counteract this message, or fact-checking organisations, the media, journalists, and so on. And of course, there was a lot of this going on at the time, but these ads, once you've seen, the effectiveness of these ads is essentially that once you've seen them, you can't unsee them. And these ads are very clever and effective at sticking in the minds of people who see them online. Particularly if you're tending to support that side of politics anyway, where they're being targeted, namely to the right of centre. Also swing voters, perhaps to a certain extent. You're already motivated essentially to believe the stories that are being propagated through these misleading advertisements. But it's interesting that there's laws to protect consumers from misleading advertisements in things like consumer products, but the laws around political advertising are much thinner, if you like. And there's good reason for that as well, in that we want to keep the hands of government out of what can be said legitimately in political debate. There's an implied freedom of political communication in Australia in the Australian Constitution, and any attempt by government to kind of restrict what can be said in political debate can be quite problematic, I guess. That said, there's a couple of jurisdictions in Australia where they have attempted to enact, or they have enacted truth in political advertising laws, and they seem to be working okay. Anyway, that's another debate, I guess. Here's an example from the Australian bushfires, an image, which went viral around the world, really, which was purported to show the extent of the bushfires burning in Australia at the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020. As it turned out, this was actually, I think, a month's worth of bushfire data. It's not obviously not a satellite image, even though it's kind of made to look like a satellite image. It's actually a generated image using data about the location of bushfires over an extended period of time, which I think was a month. So here you might say this is an example of organic misinformation, right? In the way that it spread online. Organic meaning that, it was shared by people who believed essentially that it was true. And that's why it took off around Australia. There'd been a lot of news about the bushfires around the world. And suddenly this image showing, Australia burning takes off because it's very impactful. So it's a genuine image. It was made by scientists, looking at the extent of the bushfires and so on. But again, it kind of becomes misinformation when it's taken out of that original context and begins to spread online without the caveats that that would be necessary to understand what was actually going on. In the same way that we saw with the original hoax news site and Paul Horner and so on earlier on. Here also from the bushfires, a couple of other images, again, looking at, different phenomena, if you like. On the one hand, we have an example of manipulated media or a fake image, a photoshopped image, essentially, of a girl wearing a mask to protect herself against the smoke, holding a koala in a very casual way. So again, a very impactful image, but a fake one. And on the other side, we have, again, an example of organic misinformation. This was spread also at the same time in the late 2019, early 2020 bushfires, as if it were an image taken from that time. But it's actually an older image taken from the Tasmanian fires in 2013. So again, it's a genuine image, but it's being shared in a false context. Now, who knows what the original intention was behind the sharing of this image, right? It might have been that someone did a search for images of bushfires in Australia, and this is an image that came up, and then they pick that up and share it again on social media and so on, and it takes off again. Or, perhaps less innocently, it was someone sharing the image, knowing full well that it was taken out of context and being spread in a misleading way. It's very difficult to tell, right? And here again, we can think about, okay, how do we respond to the differences between these different scenarios? Okay, how do we respond to the fact that one image is true, right? It's a genuine image, if you like, and the other one is not. But they're both being shared in ways that are kind of misleading. There might be an intention to mislead. The other one there might not be. Who knows? And again, even the manipulated image, the fake image, again, who knows why this was originally created? It might be a creative exercise in the same way that the Trump images were research or creative exercises. Once these things take off on social media, though, and online, that's when things become problematic. And that's also when it becomes very difficult to determine the intention behind the sharing of something. It also becomes very difficult in real time to determine whether something is true or false. And not everything is clearly true or false, right? Some things are moderately misleading depending on the context. As we've seen, some things are very misleading once they're put in a particular context, right? It's all very context dependent, and that makes these things very difficult to detect, very difficult to address. Here, on the other hand, is a kind of perhaps a more intentional form of manipulation or propagation of misinformation. Again, related to the Australian bushfires. So this is a video shared online. You might remember this story that I think this story was originally in the Australian, claimed that 189 arsonists had been arrested for starting bushfires in Australia. And the intention was to kind of ridicule the climate change narrative that had started to build up about the cause of the bushfires or contributing factors to the bushfires, and to assert that the problem was a series of arson attacks rather than anything related to climate change. And I would say this is obviously it's false. Well, not obviously, but it was false. So 189 people had been, there were 189 cases, if you like, but it was over a longer period of time and not related to these particular bushfires. And only a small number of those 189 cases were actually accusations about starting a fire, a bushfire. So the creation of this video, then, you would say, is intentionally misleading or deceptive, and it is false. So again, to that schema, you would say this is a form of disinformation. But what is the purpose of it? Is it the same purpose that we saw from the Internet Research Agency? This essentially non-ideological aim to disrupt foreign election processes and disrupt democratic discourse in the public sphere and so on in democratic countries. Probably not. Here, it's a very ideological purpose, from one side of politics, aiming to demote and heap ridicule on a particular narrative and to promote another narrative and so on. Now, if foreign agents get involved in promoting one of these narratives over another, then okay, here you would say there's a kind of disinformation in the old sense. But in my view, this is more like a kind of deceptive use of media or deceptive use of misinformation. Okay, now I want to step back a little bit and from these examples and think about, well, what's all the fuss here? There's always been hoaxes. There's always been satire, from ancient Greek satirical plays and so on. The rise of pamphleteering, newspapers and so on in Europe in the early modern period, and then particularly in the late 19th century journalism and so on, hoaxes abounded. In 1835, here as an example, the Great Moon Hoax, which was published in a paper called the New York Sun, which was a colourful newspaper that often was loose with the truth and had these long-running sort of serial stories. I think this was a 6-part story that they used here, where it was alleged that that a scientist had been observing through a large telescope what had been going on the moon, and he could see that there were angels and creatures there and plants and so on. And essentially, the purpose here was just to sell newspapers, right? It's a kind of a fictional purpose, but dressed up as if it's a newspaper, as if it's a news story. It's not really satire in the same sense that that we saw with Paul Horner and so on, or The Onion or Batuta Advocate. But it nonetheless caused a bit of a ruckus, and many people took it at face value because it's dressed up in this, as a kind of story of the progress of science and so on, and a scientist who'd been undertaking research and observing the moon. And you can see perhaps similarities there with the way that some misinformation spreads in the current day, around vaccine misinformation and that kind of thing, where there's often a veneer of scientific truth about them or scientific research. There's a kind of gesturing towards these conventions, if you like, and that helps to draw people in a strong way. And you might think, well, this is ridiculous, but it's 1835 and people didn't really know much about what was on the moon at that point in time. All right, now we're going to have a look at what is it? Why is it a problem then? If we had on the last slide here, why all the fuss? There's nothing new. What is new about this current wave of misinformation that we're seeing propagated, particularly online. Right, so a 2018 study of he's in a bit of a wrong order there. The 2018 study of rumor cascades on Twitter analyzed 126,000 news stories tweeted by 3 million people between 2006 and 2017. Each story was rated true or false by 6 different fact-checking organizations. The most common subject matter was false political news. So rumor cascades here is a study of how these news stories are taken up and shared or propagated on Twitter. And the findings of the study were that falsehood diffused significantly faster, on average 6 times faster, deeper and more broadly than truth in all categories of information. Okay, so false stories, false news stories spread much, much faster and further than true stories. Misinformation was 70% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter than true information. The top 1% of the false news cascades diffused to between 1,000 and 100,000 people, whereas the truth rarely diffused to more than 1,000 people. So the reach, there's a far greater reach from the false stories. And the study also looked at, did an analysis of emotional reactions using the content of the tweets and the contents of the replies and so on, in order to determine what the likely factors motivating the viral character of the false news stories were. And so these included, on the one hand, that the stories were new. The weirder the stories were, then the more likely they were to be shared. Whereas true stories often follow a predictable pattern. You've heard bits of the information before. You might have a story that confirms a narrative that's been covered in the news recently or previously. Whereas false stories, of course, there's no limits to what false stories might purport to say. So novelty was one factor, and the other factor was people's emotional reactions to the stories, and in particular, reactions like anger, fear, anticipation, trust, surprise, sadness, joy, and disgust. In particular, though, anger and fear, along with surprise at novelty and disgust, these are the sentiments which really drive the propagation of false news stories on Twitter. Why is this? Well, psychologists, have since gone on to study these phenomena, of course, and have found that this is what people engage with, right? People engage emotionally on social media. They're often not interested in whether something's true or false, factual or not. It's the emotional reaction that takes people to social media. The emotional reaction that keeps them there, and it's the emotional reaction that drives them to share pieces of content amongst their networks. And of course, that's just a psychological fact about human beings, right? Most of us, we're all rational to some extent. We're all irrational to some extent. We have emotional reactions, if you like, irrational emotional reactions, in the sense that we're not looking for truth or falsity or factual basis for things. And that's just a fact about us. But what happens on social media, online, is that an environment is created which promotes the propagation of information on the basis of these emotional reactions. And social media companies have built a business model essentially on this kind of engagement. The algorithms are designed to to keep you coming back by tapping into this need for this emotional reaction, these strong feelings that some of this content generates, and the kind of social connection that people feel with their networks, with their online networks, when they engage in this sharing behavior or online conversations or pile-ons and that kind of thing. That's what keeps people coming back. So we could say then that there's something about the online information environment itself which is driving this wave of misinformation, this infodemic, if you like, as it came to be called during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the features of the online information environment that we're looking at, or that promote, these phenomena, are the following. There's a lot greater public participation possible on social media, clearly, and on digital media generally, right? So that traditional gatekeeping function that traditional media performed, which made it difficult for people outside the media elites and the political elites, made it difficult for everyday citizens to participate in media discourses. That has kind of gone out the window with social media, right? So anyone can create content, anyone can get online, anyone can participate. And this is, people talked about the great democratization of the public sphere with the arrival of digital media. There was a lot of optimism about what that might entail in political terms, and as it turned out, unfortunately, that's kind of been overtaken by these problematic phenomena of information disorder and misinformation and so on. Another feature of the online information environment is a lack of transparency over the source of information. And all of this has to do with the atomization of content. What that means is that if you think about your feed on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, whatever it might be, it's just an endless feed with little distinction between items of content, right? It's not like going to the newsagent and buying your favorite newspaper or turning on the television on your favorite news broadcast, right? It's just a constant feed of information from different sources, stories from different sources that essentially scrolls before your eyes. Now, of course, if you look, you can find out where most things come from. But that the effect is that you're losing that kind of coherence that you get with traditional media sources, where there's editorial control and so on, and people actually putting things together for a purpose and building stories over a period of days as well, for example. And so, of course, another side of this is the algorithmic content recommenders. As we all know, the content scrolls before our eyes, and it's determined by algorithms, which have as inputs all kinds of things, including our browsing history, demographic information that the social media companies have about us, or that they've managed to scrape from other online activities, inferred data. What's trending at the moment, of course, is a big one. As we know, we all encounter videos and so on YouTube or Instagram, which we're not really interested in them, but these are things that are trending at the time. And the purpose clearly here, as I was saying before, is that the social media platforms are trying to keep us engaged and trying to keep us online, because that's how they make money, by keeping us there and exposing us to advertising. Now, together, these things kind of lead to a kind of an easy propagation and amplification of particular kinds of content, that novel content, that emotional content that we saw before. We also talked about how users, what users go online, particularly on social media for, to interact with their networks. People don't typically go on to social media in order to look at the news, right, or to find authoritative information about something. People still tend to go to news websites for that kind of thing, for example, if they're using an online device to find it. User targeting, we've already mentioned as well. A big factor here is that the algorithms, and in particular advertising, is able to be directed at particular quite narrow groups of people based on a whole range of different data points, including demographic information, interests, political leanings, marital status, and so on, socioeconomic group, race. And another aspect of the online information environment is the ease of replication and the kind of permanence of digital content. Any piece of content can be replicated endlessly and very rapidly. And this is obviously what enables sharing, and it also what enables particular pieces of information to go viral. Once they've gone viral, it's very hard to remove them, if you like. And this was seen, for example, with the live sharing of the attack on the mosque in Christchurch, for example, where the perpetrator live streamed his attack on the mosque, and the video was shared and reshared immediately, was taken up by mainstream media, and once the video was there, it was very difficult for digital platforms to try to remove it, certainly during the incident and even after the incident. But so what we see here is that there's certain what's called in the research context affordances of digital platforms. And affordances means what these online environments enable users to do. Okay, what it affords them, what possibilities does it afford them? In this sense, we might say that technology doesn't determine consumer behavior, but it influences and shapes online behavior by enabling and encouraging consumers to engage in certain ways and not in others. So all these kinds of features that we were just looking at kind of work together to create this environment that enables the easy propagation of misinformation and other problematic content. So, and the reason being, it can be very difficult for users to discern the quality of news and information and to distinguish poor quality information from high quality information. And it also means that people are frequently exposed to false, misleading, or deceptive information online, either through deliberate targeting by bad actors or ordinary users sharing information within their online networks. Another aspect of what's going on here is how the online environment relates to the offline media environment, the offline news and traditional news environment. And here it's a familiar story, which I'm sure you're all aware of as advanced journalism students, of disruption being caused to traditional media over the last couple of decades by digital media, and in particular, the loss of advertising to digital platforms. This, as we know, has caused great loss of revenue to nearly all news businesses. Perhaps the largest news businesses have been able to survive this onslaught, if you like, in some cases by actually owning some of the digital advertising platforms like real estate websites and so on. And in particular, then, for that reason, it's particularly affected small news sources, local news sources, regional news sources, and so on, which were very dependent on classified advertising advertising by local businesses and governments. And this means that we've seen, the closure of a whole range of news media businesses over the last few years, and this is a process which seems inevitable in many ways. I guess that it will continue. So what does that mean? Well, it means that news media businesses have had to find new ways of sorry, I'll just fix the light again. Yeah, so news media businesses have had to find new ways of making money, and they've had to adapt to the online news environment, if you like, because that's where the advertising dollars are. That's how they get viewers to their own websites, for example, by sharing stories, news stories on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, and so on. But as this happened, the news cycle has gone 24 hours, 7 days a week. We get media from all over the world all the time. It's always on the go. And all news media businesses, all publications are looking for engagement, user engagement, and in particular online engagement, because this is where they're trying to earn their advertising dollars, right? And so, this has led to the phenomenon of clickbait, for example. You can see down the bottom some examples of typical clickbait headlines that you might see on a news website. And it's also had other effects beyond, if you could say, what has happened here is a kind of reduction in the quality of online news. Often newspapers themselves maintain quality, right, to a large extent. But the online versions of those newspapers are driven in particular by this need for user engagement, for click-throughs, advertising click-throughs, and so on. And they use headlines and other tactics to engage an audience. Another tactic which has been proven to engage audiences is polarized content, emotional content, as we've seen again, particularly content that makes people angry, is quite effective at getting user engagement. And many news media businesses have learnt this and are increasingly turning to opinion-driven content and polarized opinion-driven content. And that's led to a reduction in the amount of traditional public interest journalism that many publications are producing. Traditional public interest journalism is also expensive to produce. It takes a lot of time and money to employ someone to go and sit in a courtroom, for example, and report on an important court case. It's much cheaper to recycle content, to have an opinion about something and publish that opinion, than it is to research a news story. The effect of all this, though, seems to be a kind of lowering of general public trust in the media and in the processes that the media is a part of, like political processes. And there's been a kind of gradual but ongoing decline in levels of public trust. Can you see at the chart on the right-hand side there that so the percentage of Americans who say they've got quite a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in newspapers and television news has been declining over a period of 25 years. So the effect is not just on online media. We'll see in a moment some statistics relating to online media, but you can see here that the general disruption here and the lowering of trust and the kind of, by disruption, I mean disruption to the public sphere as well as the economic model, is extending to traditional media and mainstream media and the public sphere in general, not just the online environment. Right, so here's another chart from the Digital News Report, Australia 2022, which is a report that's produced every year, which is based on a survey of Australians and investigates things like their news consumption habits and their attitudes towards news and the media. And so this chart here breaks down the main source of news by demographic generation. Okay, so you can see the key down the bottom there: Generation Z, Y, X, baby boomers, and age 76 and above. So you can still see on the right-hand side that the older you are, the more likely you are to have television as your main source of news. Even for young people, it's fairly significant. Generation Z at 23% and Generation Y at 25%. You can see that hardly anyone listens to the radio or reads print newspapers. That's been the case, I think, since the rise of television news. And on the left-hand side, you can see, though, that many people get their news now from online news. By online news, that means online news websites, like going to smh.com.au, for example. And you can see that particularly in the younger generations, that's their main source of news. So Generation Y, 33% people online, 33% of Generation Y, their main source of news is online news, as opposed to 25% through television. The youngest generation, Generation Z, you can see is significantly much more tilted towards social media, getting news from social media than from any of the other sources. At the same time, the trust in social media, even amongst younger people, is quite low. And here I've got statistics from the US, from the Pew Research Center, where we have seen a change, though, in the US, that the younger generations now are almost as likely to trust information on social media sites as they are information from national news outlets. You can see, though, that it's coming from a lower base, with even in the younger generations, below 50% who said that they would trust social media. That's now gone up to 50%. And you can see that the trust in traditional news is dropping across the board. And here we can also think about the political context in which, and the social context in which these phenomena are occurring. So we've looked at the online information environment, how it relates to the offline media and information environment. And here we can think about the broader political and social context. And here, since the rise of this kind of misinformation phenomenon, since the 2016 US election and so on, there's been talk of, the fact that the idea that we're entering a post-truth era in which the truth no longer matters. Doesn't matter to politicians, doesn't matter to audiences and consumers, or to society in general. Now, whether that's true or overstating things a little bit, what is clear is that there seems to be increasing political polarization, increasing disengagement with the news, and increasing disengagement from politics. Where there is engagement, it tends to be driven by by the phenomenon of polarization and by polarized narratives. So the effects of misinformation, disinformation, though, how this actually works is still a subject of research, and there's no real clear conclusions about the causes and effects of online misinformation. But it seems to be the case that, in terms of changing people's minds about things, that misinformation is not necessarily that effective. If you're if you have a reasonably settled belief about something, it's unlikely that seeing a piece of misinformation will change your mind. But, if it's not something that you've thought about too much, or you're wavering, or it's something that you're inclining towards, then misinformation can reinforce those incipient beliefs, if you like, and push you in a particular direction. And what happens is, again, that this tends, of course, then to split on polarized lines. That if you're already inclined to think about things in a particular way, because of your political leanings, for example, or your social demographic situation, then information that you encounter online that's spread through your networks, or that you encounter on social media, can reinforce these beliefs and strengthen them. So there's a rise in tolerance for false narratives when those narratives are aligned with your own views politically. And this is also true for conspiracy narratives, that research has shown that many people who share conspiracy narratives online know that they're false, but they don't care, right? Their purpose is not really to debate whether these things are true or false. The purpose is to first engage with like-minded people online. If there's a political background to it, then the purpose is to promote a particular political point of view. And you can see that, especially in the United States, where it doesn't seem to matter now whether something is true or false, whether the Democrats attempted to steal the election, for example, or whether Trump attempted to steal the election. What matters is that you're reinforcing the point of view of your in-group, and you're undermining the point of view of the out-group. So amongst conspiracy theorists, conspiracy mentality, or the participation in conspiracy groups online, and belief in conspiracy narratives is associated with these extremes, so with the poles. So again, it's a phenomenon of polarization. And that occurs on both the extreme left and extreme right. And one of the things that we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, was groups that you would think were not politically or ideologically aligned started to come together over a mutual belief in particular conspiracies. And conspiracy theories themselves started to meld into a kind of larger group of narratives. So you had the wellness influences, a kind of and a distrust of science that would traditionally have been associated perhaps with left-wing views on the one hand, and on the other, anti-lockdown freedom narratives and so on. And these came together during COVID-19, and the overwhelming narrative became one of freedom and personal choice, if you like, whether it was to do with vaccines or to do with personal liberties. Other studies have shown that most propagation of misinformation is driven by a small group of influencers. And this is very important. Most anti-vaccine misinformation is spread, I think it's over 67%, by a group of just 12 people who are most prominent on social media. And a lot of these people make quite a lot of money by propagating these narratives, again, through advertising click-throughs, as we saw at the beginning, or through selling products, for example, as Alex Jones of InfoWars has famously done. And he, he had a trial in the US, a defamation trial in the US recently that you might have been aware of, because he had propagated misinformation about the Sandy Hook school massacre in the US, and suggesting that the entire thing was a false flag operation or a hoax. And he was taken to court by the parents of some of the children killed at Sandy Hook, and lost, and was ordered to pay a significant amount of damages. In any case, the point being that he made a lot of money just by getting people to come to his website and selling things like paraphernalia, t-shirts, and health supplements and wellness products and those kinds of things. Another phenomenon that we see is that when misinformation is taken up by the mainstream media, and this is particularly relevant to you as advanced journalism students, that this can strongly amplify misinformation as well. And a study here by Axel Bruns and colleagues at the Queensland University of Technology looked at how the 5G COVID-19 conspiracy narratives started to take off in 2020. And it was when they were taken up, first of all, by particularly strong social media influencers, and then by mainstream media, that the misinformation really, the reach of the misinformation increased exponentially. So looking at the COVID-19 infodemic, more specifically, we can here again think about the the broader environment that led to or encouraged the infodemic, if you like. So on the one hand, we definitely had these social media affordances. We had people spending a lot more time online than they might otherwise do because they were in lockdown, couldn't leave the house. So that's that side about the kind of information environment, if you like, online. The other side is the fact that it was an environment of great uncertainty for most people. There was a lack of authoritative information about the virus itself, about how it was spreading, about how you could protect yourself from the virus, and so on. And this lack of information, this lack of certainty, just creates an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, if you like, that sees the rapid propagation of any piece of information that people seize onto, if you like, in order to work out what's going on. As time went on, with the government actions and so on, and increasing severity of government action as the virus came to Australia, for example, then again, this creates a particular environment where people feel threatened, they're afraid, and you started here to get that polarization starting to occur, where you would have pro-lockdown, anti-lockdown. Most people were pro-lockdown, of course. Anti-lockdown groups were much smaller, but very vocal, and a lot of their ideas and narratives were beginning to spread on social media. I mentioned before these pre-existing conspiracy and anti-vaccination beliefs that came together. A lot of the misinformation started to be driven by these groups. At the same time, there's a kind of rise in other related online phenomena that we mentioned at the beginning: race baiting, race-driven misinformation, hate speech, targeting of particular racial groups, and so on. And it's very difficult to distinguish misinformation, strictly speaking, from these other phenomena, because they're all related phenomena. Here we can look at, okay, what are some of the harms arising from misinformation? Here, the sources we've got for these harms are from the Australian Communication and Media Authority, 2 reports on misinformation. The first one, which led to the development of a code, which we'll look at in a moment, and the second one, a report to government in 2021, after the COVID pandemic had been going on for about 18 months. So I should say I've supplemented that with some other information. So the acute harms that you might see from misinformation, the most obvious being violence and civil unrest. So January 6th in the US, the storming of the Capitol building, the most prominent example there. But also here in Australia, the Wyambilla shooting with the sovereign citizens who shot and killed the police and were in turn killed themselves a couple of months ago. You see harms to individual health, for example, from the consumption of unproven treatments during the early days of the pandemic. You saw harms to public health with the drop in vaccination rate. You see financial damage, for example, damage to infrastructure, 5G towers being destroyed or damaged, education campaigns from mobile companies to try to prevent people from causing damage, to counteract this misinformation, and damages to electoral processes. Clearly, the January 6th violence was a part of that, but a general undermining in trust as well, and a threat to the smooth running and proper running of the election itself. There's also chronic harms that result, some of which we've been looking at already. This kind of decline in trust in public and democratic institutions, decline in trust, in authoritative information and traditional news media sources, and a decline in community cohesion with this increasing polarization. Again, it's difficult to know for some of these things what is cause and what is effect. I think they're very complex phenomena that we're dealing with here. Nonetheless, it seems clear that there is a problem, that there are real world effects that are damaging to society more broadly, particularly democratic society. Looking now at, what are some of the interventions that we can that are being used to mitigate the harms arising from information disorder, and how effective are they? So the first sort of intervention that we have is kind of on-platform content moderation, it's often called. So this is things like platforms. So you have an example on the down the bottom there of a intervention on Facebook. This was from the video stills that I showed you before from the Australian bushfires with the arson narrative as opposed to the climate change narrative. So this has been subject to a fact check and an intervention on Facebook. When you first load that video, this is what you encounter. So fact check, see fact check, and then if you want to click through to the post, you can. On the right-hand side, you can see a more extreme version of on-platform content moderation, which is where an account is suspended. And famously, of course, this happened to Donald Trump on Twitter. And his account, as we know, has since been restored. Sometimes this is an automated process, and sometimes it involves human intervention. So that's a brief description of, kind of on-platform measures, if you like, focused on the content itself. So is the content true or false on the one hand? Is it propagated by inauthentic behavior on the other, by bots, by fake accounts, by coordinated activity? The second type of intervention is to do with content. So on the one hand, we've got verification processes, which tends to be, before information is published, verifying that it's true. Then you have fact checking, which, arose out of a journalistic process of checking politicians' statements and publishing corrections, or fact checks of those statements if they turn out to be false in particular. Inoculation is a kind of a new idea being applied here, which is sometimes called pre-bunking, which is attempting to engage in kind of preventative measures for misinformation to discourage people from sharing or engaging with misinformation and other kinds of information disorder. And it's been shown in controlled contexts to be quite effective. If you educate people, about misinformation, that's one kind of inoculation. If you prepare them with factual information about the particular subject that you're looking at, then in these kind of controlled contexts, people do tend to share misinformation less and believe misinformation less. But the question here is whether, it's particularly effective outside these narrow contexts. In particular, the speed with which information spreads online means that these interventions under B here are always going to be behind the wave, if you like, behind the viral wave. That they're effective after the fact, but we need them to be effective before the fact. So maybe they're not the answer, if you like. There's a lot of research into media literacy, which looks at over time, clearly this is a long-term strategy, increasing people's ability to discern the quality of information that they find online. Sometimes this is, public media literacy. Sometimes it's professional training as well for journalists to help them to deal with misinformation appropriately. And the last kind of intervention that we're looking at here is to do with the design of the platforms themselves. And here we go back to those features of the online information environment that we looked at before. The kind of atomization of content, the algorithms that drive content and drive views and drive engagement. And here, the idea is to encourage, design solutions that are less, that tend less to propagate misinformation or lead to the ability of false information to be propagated more rapidly than true information. Part of here, these are quite different interventions, as you can see, and part of that shows the kind of complexity of the phenomenon that we're looking at. There's a lot of different stakeholders here. You've got platforms who have their own purposes to make money. You've got news media have their own purposes. Sometimes that's to make money. You've got the public, whose purpose is often not, as I said earlier, about engaging with authoritative information. It's about getting online and engaging with your peer groups or your enemies or whoever it might be on social media. And you've got civil society groups, minority groups who are looking to increase protections for disadvantaged groups. You've got the broader citizenry, if you like, anyone who has an interest in the functioning of the public sphere, which in a democratic country like Australia is essentially all of us, or should be all of us. And here we might conceive of misinformation as what we could call a wicked problem. It's very complex. It's multi-sided, as we just saw. It's also very dynamic and unstable. It's changing all the time. The technology is always changing. We're seeing the decline of Facebook now, perhaps the decline of Twitter, people moving to smaller platforms, alternative platforms without content moderation, people moving to group chat services and so on. We've got a kind of contested space where people don't even agree on whether there's a problem or what the problem might be, let alone what we should do about the problem. And we've got a whole lot of interdependent causes and cause and effect relationships such that it's very difficult to determine what we should do in order to mitigate, this problem. It's socially complex in that it taps into political ideologies and political differences and social differences between people and between groups of people. And yeah, as I said before, it's got these conflicting objectives from different stakeholders. And all of this comes together to create a kind of complex environment where it's very difficult for people to agree on what to do. And that includes platforms, civil society groups, governments, and other stakeholders. One particular problem that perhaps makes this even more problematic than other kinds of related problems, even online problems like child pornography, for example, is that here we're dealing with speech, and that means that we're dealing with freedom of speech and the ability of people to express their opinions online, and essentially to believe what they want to believe and what they choose to believe. And Mark Zuckerberg has famously said that he just believes strongly that Facebook shouldn't be the arbiter of truth of everything that people say online. And really, do we disagree? Do we want Facebook to be the arbiter of truth? Probably not. Do we want the government to be the arbiter of truth? I don't think so. I mean, the whole purpose of media independence and media freedom is that the government doesn't determine the truth. Experts, perhaps, but what if the experts disagree? So the three challenges here are that, truth is something that must be publicly negotiated in a kind of process, where people come together and debate. This is a process that takes place over time. And it's a difficult process, and importantly, it's a fallible one. We're not always sure what is right. When we do find false information, it's another question of what do we do with that, right? Some people argue that the only acceptable cure for misinformation is true information, right? You can't moderate information just because it's false, right? So here, a quote from Evelyn Douek, who's an Australian legal scholar living in the US. Government involvement in speech regulation is uniquely pernicious, and the cure for the problems with content moderation should not be worse than the disease. Right? Do we want digital platforms to be determining what is true or false, taking down content, preventing people from having accounts? In terms of regulation, they have the ability to do that, but is that the way forward? That brings us to a quick overview of regulatory trends, and I'm going to move quickly here because I feel we're running out of time. And it tells us that regulation is something that can be politically fraught, right? We have people saying, well, the government wants to regulate social media. They're trying to threaten freedom of speech. And these debates are happening quite clearly in the US, but they're happening here as well, and in Europe. And everywhere where there's a move towards regulating social media content. And that is a clear movement that has been happening over the last few years. The first steps were towards self-regulation, where the industry regulates itself, much as we have in the print media in Australia, for example. But now there's a move away from that towards a kind of system of co-regulation, like we have in the broadcast media in Australia, where there's a kind of cooperation between government or an independent regulator and industry in setting rules and enforcing those rules. Generally, it works by the industry kind of setting rules through a code of conduct or a code of practice, but with a regulator having the power to enforce compliance with those rules and to issue penalties where there's a lack of compliance, for example. And finally, we might look at what the implications are for journalism. And here I think, importantly for all of you as advanced journalism students is that the need to be aware of the potential for the amplification of misinformation merely through the misinformation being talked about in mainstream media. So I talked about that study from QUT before, which really shows that when something is taken up by mainstream media, even for the purpose of fact-checking it, for example, that can actually serve to propagate the misinformation much further than would have happened otherwise. So here, there's a kind of debate between whether news media should take a position of strategic silence, ignoring prominent misinformation narratives, conspiracy narratives, and so on online, or whether they should engage in a kind of strategic amplification of true or authoritative information. And here, this might lead us to, actually rethinking the concept of objectivity and how that works in the news media. Whether it's something about, this false balance idea that I'm sure you know about of, giving equal weight to two sides of an argument or two sides of a debate, and really whether the role of the media is to kind of participate in a broader process of fact finding and the fixation of truth, if you like, determining what's true and helping the public to form their own ideas about this matter by giving them a genuine sense of what is true or false, or where the evidence lies, where as the ABC Code of Practice talks about, for example, is following the weight of evidence. So a kind of balance which follows the weight of evidence, rather than a false balance which might suggest that two different sides of a debate are equally likely to be true. Right, that's where we're going to leave it for the moment. Thanks very much for listening to me, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully that's food for thought. Okay, thanks very much. Bye-bye.